All right. Well, welcome to creativeLIVE, and this is the complete course in skin, but actually it's a course in digital photography. So we're going to really see a lot about workflow and lighting and then post-production, which are all aspects of photography, not just skin. So let me get my little clicker here. So we're going to start with sort of overview of image capture workflow. But before you do anything else, as a professional photographer, you really need to calibrate your system. Really get intimate knowledge of how your camera and your lens and your lighting perform. So that means we have to shoot a test. And the test is about the camera, lens, and lighting. And what I put a bit of this discussion in my book. I have another book called Mastering Exposure, where I went into this in a bit more detail. And we can't go into too much detail here because we have a limited amount of time, but I want to talk about how to shoot a test, which is essentially shooting in a range of exposures to kind of determine what the dynamic range of your camera is. And calibrating color, I like the little X-Rite color passport, and we'll talk about that. It's very simple, and how to save your settings in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. I'm a big proponent of Lightroom, and that's my sort of the hub of my workflow. Everything goes in and out of Lightroom. Once you've shot this test and you've determined your settings, you can save a new camera default so that you know whenever you open up files from your camera, a sort of standard setting can be applied. All right, so shooting the test. I always shoot a test with a color checker target, and this is my testing setup. The 24 patch, it's now X-Rite color checker. It's known as a Munsell chart. It's been standard in the industry for many, many years. And a human subject. These two, here I'm going to point to them over here. These two patches on the color checker are supposed to represent dark and light skin. But I've never met a person yet that actually had skin that was that color. So it is, I think, important to get a real true picture of how your camera captures color, to have a real person in the test shot. And if you're stuck for a model, you can use the self-timer like I did here. I set the camera on a self-timer and run into the picture myself. I have this little black trap, which is a box with a hole cut in it. Inside the box is black velvet. So it's sort of an absolute reference for absolute black. Not absolutely necessary, but it's a nice thing to be able to take a reading of what absolute black actually is in a raw capture. And I have something similar here. This is a diffused white reference. I use a styrofoam lens packing sort of material, which you can't really get anymore. They now use paper to pack the lenses, but it happens to be a very reflective surface, so it will always clip to white. And it's nice to, in your exposure range, to be able to identify when the exposure clips this lightest possible thing and it starts to clip to white. And then this part here, I write down the number that would represent the ISO for that exposure. So when we shoot a range of exposures, sometimes, now very often actually, the ISO as recommended by the manufacturer of the camera is not the actual best ISO for that camera under any given lighting conditions. So you have to shoot a test to find out. And the tests, you want to evaluate the test not on the LCD of the camera. So you don't want to rely on that to determine your exposure. I know everybody looks at the back of the camera, but the LCD really is not accurate. It sort of represents the in-camera JPEG, and we should be shooting RAW because we want better than JPEG quality. And the LCD can't show you exactly what you're really getting in the RAW file. And often the histogram, on most cameras, you get a kind of a composite histogram. You don't actually see red, green, and blue separate histograms. You can on some of the Canons offer that feature, but it's often inconvenient to switch to it. And many cameras just simply show you the composite histogram. So it's not really accurate because you can't tell if you're clipping in the red channel, for instance, because the composite will shift the representation, and you may think you're okay, and you either have clipping or you can actually overexpose more than the histogram's indicating. I am a big proponent of using a light meter. I like the Sekonic meters, and I'm going to be talking about my meter here is the L758DR. It's the digital meter. I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but any kind of handheld meter is preferred for shooting the test. And ideally, it's good to use a reflective meter, and the Sekonic can do both. So you have the little white dome, which is your incident meter, and you can switch it so that you can actually take a spot meter reading. I use that to take a meter reading off of the test target to get the middle gray value. Okay. So we're not going to actually do this live here, but the idea is to shoot your test subject and bracket the exposure. So by 1/3, in my case, shooting a Canon, I'm shooting 1/3 f-stops. And I shoot multiple exposures, getting brighter and getting darker. I recommend that on the lighter side, you expose at least 4 f-stops overexposed. And then on the darker side, at least 5. If you have a Nikon camera, you might need to go a little more. The interesting thing is that from middle gray, the camera actually isn't really linear in the sense that middle gray is actually a middle value as far as the camera is concerned. You have more latitude on the shadow side before you end up losing that, by underexposing. At some point, you're going to drive that middle gray patch to black, and it will, sort of fall off the cliff, as it were. That tends to be between 4 and 5 f-stops on the shadow side. On the highlight side, it's more like maybe 3 f-stops. So you have much less room to overexpose before you clip on the highlight side, and more room on the shadow side. So you want to run your brackets to make sure that you cover that range. And then what you're going to do is evaluate the exposures based on the mid-gray patch. So the mid-gray patch is this patch here on the color checker target. That's supposed to be 50% luminosity. And this is your sort of white patch and your black patch. These aren't actually maxima white or black, but for the target they are. But this is what you base your exposure on. Then as we underexpose it, this patch will get darker and darker and darker. When it reaches the point where it's indistinguishable from this patch, which will already be black, that's your sort of your clipping point. You don't want to be underexposed past that. When you're overexposing, it's going to get brighter and brighter and brighter, and right before it turns white, so that it will match the white of this patch, that's your endpoint on the highlight side. So again, don't look at the LCD. This is not going to tell you which is the correct or the best exposure. You're going to measure the mid-gray patch in Lightroom and base your exposures off the meter reading, and then evaluate which one is the actual best exposure. And you may, my methodology is I always start on what I expect the best exposure to be, and then open up, and come back to it. This would be my expected best exposure, and then I'm stopping down. If at all possible, try and use shutter speed to change the exposure. The f-stop it's not quite as accurate, actually, most of the time with most lenses. And the shutter speeds are timed electronically nowadays. They're not actually timed by the curtain. Nikon still have a shutter curtain, but the actual timing of the exposure is electronic. So the shutter curtain is just there to make the chip visible to the light. But the duration is controlled more tightly by the electronic timing of the signal off the chip. So you can actually get more accurate exposure differences by using the shutter. And then you're going to look at that mid-gray patch in Lightroom and find the value that's closest to 50%. Lightroom gives you percentage numbers, if you have noticed in the RGB number readout underneath the histogram. It gives you percentage numbers. So you'll find the exposure, the best exposure will be the one that's closest to 50%. And you may find that your camera deviates from what the manufacturer says is its true ISO. So again here, to review, you're determining the best exposure is the one that's closest to 50%. After that, you're going to look for those endpoints, as I was talking about before. Right before the mid-gray patch turns white, that's your endpoint for your dynamic range, and you'll count from your ideal mid-tone exposure. You'll count f-stops to the exposure that gets that patch just before it goes to white, and that's your dynamic range. And the same thing on the shadow side. Right before that mid-gray patch turns black, that's the low point of your dynamic range, so your plus and minus. So you count f-stops over, and then you add it together, and that gives you the total number of f-stop dynamic range, real dynamic range. And not just what the manufacturer says, 11 stops or whatever. I mean, I've never found a camera that actually lived up to that. In real world, actual tonal values. So this is I made this little table here, represents my Canon 5D Mark II. Every camera is slightly different, so you have to actually shoot this test to determine it. So what I've done is I shot the same exposure bracket test in different lighting conditions: shade, sun, tungsten, and flash. So those are all the lighting. If you only use one condition, like if you only shoot with tungsten lights indoors, then you only need to test for that. But if you shoot in all these different conditions, it's a good idea to test all of them. And what's interesting, you see here the exposure compensation column here. So it means minus 1/3 means that the camera's actually more sensitive than the ISO indicates. So it was more like 125 instead of ISO 100. I set the ISO here in shade and sun both to 100 and also in flash. In tungsten, I set it to 640 because I almost never have enough light in tungsten lighting situations, so I'm always shooting with the ISO at least at 640. I like to do these tests at the lowest ISO that I'm likely to use, because that's generally the highest quality. So here, shade, you see my exposure compensation was -1/3. It's actually more sensitive to light, so the ISO would be more like 125. So I have to dial in a -1/3 exposure compensation in the camera when I'm shooting in shade. With sun, it's actually, I have to actually add 1/3 of exposure. I have to overexpose slightly. It's kind of strange, and not every camera behaves this way, but very often cameras will not behave linearly in different colored light. You can kind of see a pattern here. Tungsten, the warmest light, I'm having to add 2/3 of an f-stop compensation to get a correct exposure. 2/3 of a stop. I mean, that's fairly big. So if you're not doing that with this camera, I would be underexposed all the time by 2/3 of a stop. Flash works out to be no compensation. It's exactly ISO 100. So it's interesting that the cooler light, the chip seems to be more sensitive to cooler light. In shade, I'm actually stopping down to get the right exposure. As the light warms up, I have to add exposure until I get to tungsten, which is the warmest light, and I'm adding the most exposure. That just seems to be the way this particular chip has been responding. So it's not linear across different colored lights. Very interesting. And the only way you're going to find out about your camera is to shoot that test. Yeah?
I see that on your chart you're making a reference to the zone system for zone 1 and zone 9.
Yeah.
Remind me, it's been a little while, but aren't zone 1 and zone 2 having a rich black with no detail?
Yes, but with digital, it's kind of interesting because you have so much more latitude in terms of what you can do after the fact, right? I've found that if you have a tone at zone 1, which is just slightly, lighter than black, you can actually pull detail out of that in your post-processing. And same thing, oddly in digital, that it behaves kind of more linearly on the highlight side, where as it gets brighter and brighter and brighter, it'll clip to white. But it's a straight line, right? So instead of having that, like we would think of the tone curve as being a curve. So on film, as you increase exposure, it kind of rounds off at the top, and the demarcations from one zone to the other are much narrower. Mm-hmm. With digital, it's more linear in the sense that each step, each zone is approximately the same distance away from its neighbor. So we can go all the way to zone 9, and there's actually still enough gray there that I can pull a sense of texture out of it if I need to. And also with the dynamic range of these cameras, the high bit depth capture, the raw file, when we do a kind of recovery operation to recover detail that looks like it's missing in the preview, suddenly we can find lots of tonal information there. So yes, I'm using the zone system. It kind of expanded for digital, so going from
just for clarification. So a part of what I'm seeing here is based on what you're getting by looking at the image and then understanding that you can recover those details.
Well, I'm actually measuring a zone, zone 1 and a zone 9 exposure on percentages in Lightroom.
Okay.
So I can see what the percentage numbers are. And so in percentage numbers, if you're at 90%, that would be a zone 9. And if you're at 10%, that's a zone 1.
Okay.
So, you can see how many f-stops you have to be to get to that zone 9. So in this case, on my camera, it was 2, from the mid-tone from zone 5, in 2 1/3 stops, I'm reaching zone 9. So it's not linear on either side of.
That's interesting.
Of the mid-tone. Yes.
So Lee, just for some folks, including Mary in Costa Rica asked this, but who are not as familiar with the zone system, could you just do a really brief, not go into in-depth, but what is the zone system and maybe where people can learn more about it?
Okay. The zone system was developed by Ansel Adams, and he sort of made it famous as a way of controlling exposure and the rendering, tonal rendering of the image. And it's a very rigorous system of visualizing tonal ranges in terms of these 9 zones. So he split from black to white, he split the image down into 10 steps. So in digital, I use 11 steps because the midpoint, the 50%, ends up right in the middle that way. But anyway, the zone system is just a way of kind of like dividing the tones up and being able to identify, say, okay, that's a zone 1, this is a 2, and you'd have kind of this reference, these zonal reference, which you could apply to any image that you're working with. And he built, Adams developed a whole strategy for exposing to the zones, and he was dealing with wet chemistry and the time that a film spent in the developer and how you could push from a zone 5, get it to go to +1 zone, and all these different things would affect the contrast and tonal rendering. Now in the world of digital, that is so easy to do. We can push zones around willy-nilly. So the digital zone system is actually kind of a simplification, because all I'm really concerned with is making sure that I've captured information between zone 1 and zone 9. Then the zones between those can be pushed around and manipulated with curves in Photoshop, like, unbelievable amount. Yeah.
Would it be fair to say, just generally speaking, that Ansel Adams was essentially developing his own version of a histogram to be able to play with by developing the zone system, with zone 1 being the blacks and zone 9 being the highlight detail?
Yeah,
sort of?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, it's actually much more valuable than a histogram. A histogram, despite its being, promoted so heavily, it doesn't really tell you that much. It's a statistical distribution of values in an image. But, that's going to look radically different if you're shooting a snow scene versus, a black cat in a coal mine kind of thing, So a good histogram could look horrible depending on what image it's applying, it's applied to. You certainly wouldn't want a histogram that looked like a normal spread if your scene was the black cat in the coal mine. So knowing, on the other hand, that knowing where your zone 9 is in that scene, so you're not underexposing it, gives you a lot more information. And so when we shoot this test, and you determine like your dynamic range, here, I'm just adding the 2 numbers, how many stops below zone 5 and how many stops above, and that's the total. I have 7 stops. And then where your limits are for your camera. So using a spot meter is really ideal for this sort of zonal thinking, because you can take your spot meter and put it on any tone in the scene. So if you have a white t-shirt, you can put the spot meter on and go and know, okay, am I going to be overexposing that white t-shirt or white wedding dress, say, if, how many f-stops can I open up to make sure that that stays within that limit and doesn't fall past zone 9. And consequently, also for the shadow, like the black tuxedo, the spot meter, you can actually measure that. It's a little less convenient to use the meter in the camera for that sort of thing. You'd have to actually walk way up and make sure you weren't putting a shadow on the subject and try to fill the frame with white or black to get those limits. And it, you could apply to anything, any scene that you're photographing. In general, though, you don't have to get all that crazy. You're mostly going to be basing your exposure off of a mid-tone placement. And so averaging the values in the camera, if you're using the in-camera meter, you can kind of get a feel for it. But this, as a first step, is really valuable information to kind of know what your camera's doing. So that if you're inside under tungsten light, and it's kind of orange, warm colored light, you're probably going to be having to add exposure beyond what your meter seems to be telling you. So you're going to cheat your exposure to the plus side. Yeah.
Have you seen a lot of variation from one Mark II to another Mark II? I mean, is that a part of the thought behind this?
Well, I don't have two Mark II, so I haven't seen it in my testing, but between the 5D Mark II and a 1DS, there was a difference. And from one camera to the next, there's a difference. It's not going to be huge, maybe a third of a stop, different between the two cameras of the same make. But you won't know unless you test your own camera exactly where you happen to fall. You might be lucky and you fall right in the middle of the manufacturing tolerance, and then you're golden, right? Then it's going to behave just exactly the way they expect it to behave. But very often it doesn't work out that way. If all of that testing is like too much for you, because it's shooting a lot of exposures and getting in there and analyzing it, Sekonic has kind of an interesting system that they use they've developed this for their digital meter. So this is the L758 DR, the digital master meter, and it has a USB port on it. So you can actually hook the meter up to a computer, and they have software that what you do is you shoot this target. You have to buy this target from them, and it's not cheap. I forget what it is, but you buy this target, and it's sort of like getting a color checker, a big color checker target, but it has these gray patches on it. And you take 3 exposures. So you take a normal exposure, a +3, and a -3 stops. So you only have to take 3 exposures. And then you feed these images, you process them in Lightroom the way to normal, the way you would, and feed it to the meter software. And then the software analyzes all the patches and figures out your dynamic range, tells you where your endpoints are, and puts that into the meter itself as a profile. It also calibrates the meter. So you take a meter reading with the spot meter. You go up and measure the mid-gray patch here. You measure that, and then you also take an incident reading in the same light. Very often they don't agree. They may be off, but usually like a third or 2/3 or something like that. And the process of running these images through the software builds a profile that calibrates the meter so that both the incident and the spot will agree in terms of how they record the exposure. So that's a good thing.
Is that something that you have to do on a regular basis?
You only have to do it once, really, for the meter. You can store 3 profiles in the meter, and you can switch between which profile you're reading. It's not like a color management profile. It's just a profile for the meter exposuring system. So what I recommend is to shoot the test in 3 different kinds of light so that you can be switching, because apparently the digital cameras don't respond to different colored light the same way. So as the light's cooler, they're a little more sensitive. You want to put that sort of calibration into your meter. If you're going to be using the meter, all the time, then you can calibrate it for those different colored lights, and then all you have to do is take a meter reading and set your camera to whatever the meter tells you. And you don't have to think about, oh, I've got to do +3, or plus 2/3, or plus 1/3 here, or minus 1/3. You just set your camera to whatever the meter says. So, kind of cool.
Quick question for you, Lee.
Yeah.
From a number of people on the internet. Does this change by lens that you're using?
That's a good question. If you are, say, a Canon shooter and you're using all Canon glass, the difference between one lens and the other is so minimal that it's almost not worth, bothering with. I would say unless it's a kind of an exotic lens, like you were using a fisheye or something like that. But we use those types of lenses so infrequently that it's probably not worth bothering with. Now, if you are using Canon glass and, say, a Tokina or a Sigma or some other manufacturer's glass, there will be a difference between how those two lenses perform in terms of both exposure and kind of contrast. And so if it's important to you, then you may need to test the other lens. Yeah, good question. All right, so we move on. Okay, so the other thing that is interesting about a meter, and really, like here, using flash, trying to determine flash exposure, you have to use a meter. You can use the meter to measure contrast ratios, and I'm showing here the dome retracted. So in this configuration, I would point it at the light. So I'd say if I have a backlight, I would point the meter at the light, take a reading, then point the meter at the front light, take a reading, and I can then measure like the contrast ratio between those two lights. And cinema DPs, director of photographies, use this approach all the time. So they're always like measuring the lights and figuring out contrast ratios. We don't see it used that way as often with stills, but it is something that, it's a good thing to know how to do. The other thing that the meter does in this system, see here I show you the camera, that's how you would change from one profile to the other. They call it camera 1, 2, 3. The other thing you can do they have this little mid-tone button, and when you push the mid-tone button, the next exposure reading you take will be considered the mid-tone. And then the next two exposure readings you take will be considered a highlight and a shadow. So you better be reading something that's appropriate there. And they'll all three be displayed on the meter in a graphic display, which you can manipulate with this little jog wheel. So let me show you how that works. So for instance here, this is the display at the bottom. The 0 is considered the mid-tone, and then the sort of spread of points on either side of that. So I took 3 readings. So my first reading after pushing that mid-tone button gets put here by default. Then I measured the highlight, it ended up there. And I measured the shadow and it ended up there. And I'm looking at this going, these areas down here, these are my clipping points. See the two triangles over here? That represents my limits, my personal limits based on my testing. And so I don't want to put the low exposure that close to the end if I can help it. And I've got more room on the highlight side. So I can use the jog wheel to just move that whole spread over. See here, I push the jog wheel, and then I can move these points to put them on the higher end. I place my highlight reading closer to the white clipping point. So now I've got better data to work with. And I can see that it still fits within my limit. So my highlight, midtone, and shadow fall well within my range. And whenever possible, I'm trying to keep it on the upper end of that range. And this is measured from the scene. It's not like just a guess looking at the histogram on the camera. Yeah.
So you're keeping it pushed more towards the highlights because you know that you're going to be able to recover more from the shadows? Is that?
I can always make it darker, and the more you have it well lit or well exposed, the less noise you're going to have. So if my shadow, I can manipulate the zonal placement. My shadow should be black, right? So if my shadow is not even a zone 9 but a zone 8, there will be less noise in that area, and I can force it to go to black very easily. So that's why I tend to want to be overexposing just a little bit, but at least this way I know that I'm not pushing it off the cliff. That highlight value falls within the range, and I can look on the meter and see it really quickly. So if you get good at this with this meter, you can be confident in kind of difficult situations like in a wedding. You can sometimes get crazy contrasty light, and of course the bride is standing in the white dress right as the ray of light is hitting it, and the groom in the black tuxedo is in the shadow. And you're like, you can take a meter reading and know just how far you can overexpose that brightly lit dress before you run out of room. Okay, now we've all been just talking about exposure calibration, right? Has nothing to do with color. Color actually turns out to be a much easier problem as far as calibration goes, because we just take a picture of this color passport. The X-Rite system has this little kind of booklet thing, and you just get a good exposure of it, which you now already know how to make a good exposure, right? And that's all you need to do. And then you run it through their software. So I take I shoot it in both tungsten. This is tungsten light and daylight. Gray balance. So I'll do the white balance to this patch. And then you export it in Lightroom. The Color Passport software runs as an export plugin. So you go to export it, and you get this X-Rite preset, and it sort of walks you through it. You select those two shots, the one done in tungsten light, one done in daylight, and you can build a dual illuminant profile, which is designed to work with Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw's system of color, the way that it renders color, and it makes a profile that for your camera. So you just hit export. It makes the profile, puts it in the right place, in the preferences, and you're good to go. So then when you actually set up your camera defaults, you can choose this profile for that camera, save it as your camera default, and then every time you develop something from that particular camera, you've already got that profiled. So you get the best possible color you can. When we're actually shooting, after you've done all this calibration, then the only thing left really when you shoot is to try and get a good white balance. So the ideal thing is to use some sort of gray card. I have a couple of gray cards with me, and we'll show that when we're actually doing the shoot. I didn't bring this one with me just because I didn't want to carry that much stuff on the airplane, but this one's kind of nice because it pops open, and the other side's a white reflector, so you can use it as a reflector or like a 50% gray card. So this also works for when you're far away from the subject. You can have them hold that, and you can take a meter reading off this larger gray area. It would be easier to fill the frame of your DSLR with a big thing like this than it would with a tiny little, gray card.